War does not start on the battlefield. It starts in a budget meeting. And once a country builds a defense machine, the machine does not like to shrink. Not because someone is evil, not because a shadow group controls everything, but because incentives lock in. And when incentives lock in, the system runs itself. Today, defense spending is hitting record highs. Arms company revenues are hitting record highs. And markets are pricing in a new baseline. So here is the question. What happens when security becomes a growth industry? What happens when defense becomes a business model? What happens when a country builds a machine that feeds on fear, contracts, and momentum? That is what we're breaking down today. Not to be cynical, and not to glorify war, but to understand how power behaves when money, survival, and national pride are in the same room. Chapter 1. Eisenhower's Warning. In January 1961, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower delivered a warning. He said a new force had formed, a permanent alliance, between military planning, industrial capacity, and political power. He gave it a name, the military-industrial complex. Most people hear that phrase and think conspiracy, secret rooms, hidden hands, a shadow government. But the truth is more unsettling. You do not need a conspiracy to build a machine. You only need incentives. And once incentives lock in, the system runs itself. Chapter 2. The Boom. What changed? Today, the world is spending more on the military than at any other point in modern history. SIPRI estimates global military expenditure reached $2.718 trillion in 2024, a record, and it was the steepest year-on-year increase in decades. At the same time, the largest arms-producing companies posted record combined arms revenues in 2024, $679 billion, also a record. And in early January 2026, European defense stocks surged to record highs again, not because one company won a war, but because markets priced in something deeper, a structural shift. A belief that defense spending is no longer a temporary spike, it is a new baseline. Chapter 3. The Question. So here is the question. If war is politics, and politics is power, then what happens when security becomes a growth industry? What happens when defense becomes a business model? What happens when a country builds a machine that feeds on fear, contracts, and momentum? That is what we're breaking down today. Not to be cynical, and not to glorify war, but to understand how power behaves when money, survival, and national pride are in the same room. We are going to use a brutal lens. Machiavelli. Not because Machiavelli loved cruelty, but because he refused to lie to himself. He looked at power the way an engineer looks at a machine, not how it should work, how it actually works. Machiavelli did not study politics as a debate club. He studied it as a survival arena. He asked one question again and again: what keeps a state standing when pressure hits? And his answer was never romantic. He focused on what forces leaders to act: fear, reputation, loyalty, timing. He understood something most modern people forget. In politics, perception is not a side effect. It is the battlefield. A ruler can be rational. A ruler can be good. But if the public believes the ruler is weak, the ruler becomes weak, because the public reacts to belief, not private truth. This is why Machiavelli talked so much about appearances, not because he wanted people to be fake, because appearances become reality in public life. Now apply that to modern defense.
If Machiavelli looked at today's defense boom, he would not start with weapons. He would start with legitimacy, with obedience, with the emotional contract between ruler and people. Because legitimacy is the real fuel. When people believe the state can protect them, the state is stable. When they doubt it, everything becomes shaky. Elections become volatile, protests grow faster, opposition gains energy, and enemies watch. Machiavelli would say a ruler must avoid being despised, and nothing creates contempt faster than looking unprepared. So defense becomes a shortcut to legitimacy. A leader can say, without saying it directly, "I am protecting you," and that sentence is priceless. Now, here is the key idea. Fear is a currency. Fear buys speed. Fear buys permission. Fear buys silence. Fear buys budgets. When the public is calm, people ask hard questions. They demand efficiency. They ask for proof. They criticize waste. But when the public is afraid, people accept urgency. They accept costs. They accept shortcuts. They accept secrecy. And that's not because people are stupid. It's because fear changes the brain. Fear makes people value certainty more than accuracy. Fear makes people prefer action over debate. Fear makes people forgive mistakes if the leader looks decisive. This is why security is the most powerful political product. It is the one product that can always be sold, because nobody wants to be the person who cut the shield. And Machiavelli would go one step deeper. He would say fear does not need to be invented. It only needs to be framed. A leader cannot control every crisis, but a leader can control how the crisis is interpreted. Is it an isolated event or a sign of permanent danger? Is it manageable or existential? That frame determines everything that comes next: budgets, policies, alliances, oversight, and the public mood. Now, there's another Machiavelli idea you must understand. He believed that power hates dependency. In his time, he warned against mercenaries, because mercenaries fight for money, not for you. They are loyal only while incentives align. So Machiavelli would look at modern defense systems and ask, who controls the instrument? Who controls the supply chain? Who controls the spare parts? Who controls the upgrades? Because if you do not control your instrument, you do not truly have power. You have a rental, and rentals come with strings. That's why this topic matters. Because the defense boom is not only about spending, it's about what kind of state is being built. A state that can act independently, or a state that must negotiate with its own machinery. Now, here's your goal as the viewer. By the end of this video, you will be able to see the defense machine clearly, not as good or evil, but as a system. You will understand the levers. You will recognize the patterns. You will stop being emotionally pulled by fear headlines, and you will start seeing incentives. That's the upgrade. Because once you understand the machine, you cannot be hypnotized by it. And here is why you must watch the full episode. Most people stop at the surface. They say, it's corruption, or they say, it's necessary. Both are lazy conclusions. The real truth is deeper. In the next chapters, we will break down the 3 engines that keep this machine alive: budget, narrative, procurement. Then we will reveal the concept that explains why temporary defense spending almost never returns to normal: contract gravity. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So keep going, because the real battlefield is not in the sky, it's on paper. And if you don't understand that, you will never understand modern power.
Chapter 5. Why the Machine Never Sleeps. Here is the core truth. Defense is one of the only areas where more is easier to justify than less. In most government spending,
More creates an argument. More schools? People ask about waste. More healthcare? People ask about efficiency. More infrastructure? People ask who benefits. But more security? The argument changes. Now it becomes emotional. Now the question is not, is it efficient? The question becomes, do you want to be safe? And that question is a trap. Because nobody wants to answer it the wrong way. Nobody wants to be the person who said less right before something happened. That is why the machine never sleeps. It is a political ratchet. It moves in one direction, up. Here is how the ratchet works. If a leader increases defense spending and nothing happens, the public feels calm. But the leader gets no credit. No headline says nothing happened today. No voter celebrates disaster avoided. So the leader gets silence. But if a leader restrains spending and something happens, even if it is unrelated, the leader gets blame. Why were we unprepared? Why did you cut? Why didn't you act? And that blame can end a career. So leaders learn an instinct. Over-prepare, overspend, over-signal. Even if privately they want restraint. This is not always corruption. Often it is survival strategy. Now add the media cycle. Security headlines are high emotion, high attention, high urgency. And in modern politics, attention is oxygen. So security becomes a stage. Leaders announce packages. They visit bases. They speak in hard language because it signals strength. And strength is a political asset. This is where Machiavelli would nod. He understood rulers are trapped by perception, not only by enemies, but by their own people. A leader can be right. A leader can be careful. But if people feel fear, they demand speed. They demand certainty. They demand visible action. So the state responds with visible action. And defense spending is visible. It looks like protection, even when it is inefficient, even when it is slow, even when it creates dependency. Now let's make this practical. Imagine a cabinet meeting. A minister says we should increase spending. Nobody wants to be the person who says no. Because if something goes wrong later, that no becomes a weapon. So even cautious people vote yes, because they fear blame. So the system pushes upward. Now add another layer. Defense spending also creates jobs, factories, contracts, local pride. Every region wants its plant. Every politician wants its investment. So spending becomes tied to domestic power, not only foreign threats. That means even if the threat declines, the jobs remain. And politicians protect jobs, because jobs protect votes. Now the machine has two fuel sources: fear outside and incentives inside. This is why it does not sleep, because it has redundancy. Now add bureaucracy. Large systems expand by nature. They create departments, committees, rules, standards. Each layer exists to manage risk, but each layer also makes the system harder to reverse. So when a crisis hits, governments respond fast. They spend, they sign, they commit. Then the crisis cools down. But the system does not shrink, because shrinking is painful. Shrinking means layoffs. Shrinking means contracts canceled. Shrinking means admission that the last decision was too much. Politicians avoid that. So the spending stays. and slowly becomes the new normal. That is the definition of a machine, a structure that continues beyond the original reason it was built. Now, some people hear this and think it means defense is bad. That is not the point. The point is, defense spending is politically unique. It is protected by fear, protected by blame avoidance, protected by jobs, protected by institutions. So it grows more easily than almost anything else. And the danger is not only money. The danger is dependency. The danger is that spending becomes a substitute for strategy, a substitute for diplomacy, a substitute for long-term planning, a substitute for resilience. So here is the hook for the next chapter. If this machine grows because of incentives, what are the exact incentives? What are the engines? If you can name the engines, you can predict the next move. And once you can predict the move, you can understand power in real time. That's what we do next. Budget, narrative, procurement.
Chapter 6. The Three Engines. Now let's make this concrete. The defense boom runs on three engines: budget, narrative, procurement. If you understand these three, you understand the machine, and you will stop being surprised by the headlines. Let's start with engine 1. Budget. When defense spending rises year after year, budgets become sticky. Because budgets are not only money, budgets are commitments. They create factories. They create jobs. They create training pipelines. They create specialized suppliers. They create long-term plans that take years to unwind. So a defense budget is not like buying groceries. It is like building a city. Once it exists, it becomes part of the landscape. And once it becomes part of the landscape, cutting it becomes politically dangerous. Here's why. Defense jobs are concentrated. They are visible. They are local. A politician can point to them and say, "I delivered." So defense money becomes domestic leverage, not only security policy. That's why the first engine is simple. Money becomes a constituency, a group that depends on the spending, and constituencies fight to survive. Now engine 2, narrative. Defense spending requires permission, and permission is a story about danger, a story about duty, a story about we must. In calm times, that story is harder. People ask for proof. They ask for trade-offs. They ask why now. But in crisis times, that story becomes effortless. Crisis compresses debate. Crisis rewards certainty. Crisis makes questioning look like weakness. So the narrative engine speeds up the whole machine. When the story is strong enough, oversight becomes weaker. Questions become suspicious. Doubt becomes disloyal. This is not always propaganda. Sometimes it is just social pressure. But it has the same effect. It reduces friction. Now here is the Machiavelli part. Machiavelli would say the crowd wants to feel protected, and the ruler wants to look capable. So the ruler uses narrative to create legitimacy. That legitimacy becomes permission. That permission becomes budget. Narrative is not decoration. Narrative is the key that opens the vault. Now engine 3, procurement. This is the hidden engine because most people never see it. They see politicians. They see speeches. They see uniforms. They see factories. But procurement is where the machine becomes permanent. Procurement is not just buying equipment. It is writing the rules of the future.
Because procurement defines what gets built, who gets paid, what supply chains exist, which allies you depend on, which technologies become standard, which become obsolete. So procurement is a form of state design. It shapes capability for decades, and it creates dependency chains that are hard to break. This is also where power can hide, because procurement lives in technical language, timelines, requirements, standards. Procurement offices can make decisions that shape billions, without the public ever noticing. So the third engine is silent, but it is powerful. Now, here is the real insight. These engines reinforce each other. Budget funds capacity. Capacity creates jobs. Jobs create political pressure. Political pressure strengthens narrative. Narrative increases permission. Permission expands budgets. Procurement locks in suppliers. Suppliers lobby for stability. Stability becomes national interest. And now the system is self-reinforcing, like a loop. That is the defense machine. Not one person, a loop. Now, let's give a simple example. A crisis hits. The narrative engine says we must act. Budgets expand. Procurement accelerates. Contracts are signed quickly. Factories scale up. Jobs grow. Local politics becomes dependent. Now, even if the crisis fades, the loop remains. Because the new capacity needs use. The new workers need wages. The new suppliers need orders. So new reasons appear. Modernization, readiness, deterrence, long-term threat, and the loop continues. This is why you must understand procurement, because procurement is where temporary turns permanent. Procurement is where urgency becomes architecture. Now, here is the hook. Most people still think this machine requires villains. They think it requires corruption. They think it requires evil intent. But the truth is more disturbing. The machine can grow even when everyone thinks they are doing the right thing. That is Chapter 7. No villains required.
Chapter 7. No villains required. Here is the part most people miss. This machine does not require evil. It requires normal humans responding to normal incentives. That is why it is so hard to stop. Because you can't defeat it by pointing at one bad actor. You can't arrest an incentive. Let's break it down. Politicians want to avoid blame. That is rational. If a politician is seen as weak on defense, they lose trust, they lose elections, they lose power. So they prefer decisions that protect them from future accusations. That often means spending more, not less. Military leaders want readiness. That is rational. Their job is to prepare for worst-case scenarios. If they underprepare and something happens, people die. So they push for capability, more options, more systems, more resilience. Companies want predictable revenue. That is rational. Defense manufacturing is expensive. It requires long planning, specialized labor, complex supply chains. So companies push for long-term contracts because long-term contracts reduce uncertainty. Workers want stable jobs. That is rational. If your region depends on a factory, you want that factory to stay open. You want more orders. You want more investment. So communities become emotionally tied to defense spending, not because they love war, because they love stability. Now look at what happens when you combine these rational forces. You get a system that naturally grows, not because it is evil, because it is aligned.
And when a system is aligned, it becomes strong. Now add one more ingredient: moral language. Defense spending often uses moral framing: protect the people, support the troops, defend democracy. Those can be valid claims, but they also create a shield around the spending. Because if you question spending, you can be framed as questioning protection. So restraint starts to feel like betrayal, not because it is, because the narrative makes it feel that way. This is where Machiavelli would be very sharp. He would say, politics is not only policy, it is emotion, it is symbolism, it is the management of public mood. And moral framing is one of the strongest tools to manage mood. Now add the organizational layer. Large institutions are risk-averse. They avoid decisions that look like weakening. So even internal committees will choose the path of least blame. More funding, more redundancy, more projects. Because if they choose less and something fails, their career is over. So the system selects for expansion. Now notice what we are saying. We are not saying defense is wrong. We are not saying threats are fake. We are saying incentives create momentum, and momentum becomes policy. Now, if you want to change momentum, you need friction. You need oversight. You need transparency. You need clear strategy. But those tools are hardest to use in crisis, because crisis compresses time. Crisis rewards urgency. Crisis punishes doubt. So the system is designed to grow exactly when oversight is weakest. That is the trap. Now, here is the deeper reason restraint feels like betrayal. Insecurity creates a psychological need. People want certainty. They want strong symbols. They want visible action. Defense spending becomes a ritual of certainty, a way to say, we are doing something. So if a leader says, let's slow down, the public can hear it as, we are doing nothing, even if that is not true. And that is why the machine doesn't need villains. It only needs humans. Humans protecting careers, protecting jobs, protecting identity, protecting pride. Now, here is the hook. If the machine grows through incentives, where does it become irreversible? Where does it lock in? Answer: contracts. Long-term procurement creates gravity. Once a contract is signed, it generates decades of dependency. It generates upgrades, maintenance, training, parts, relationships. And that's the mechanism that turns temporary into permanent. That is Chapter 8. Contract gravity.
Now let's zoom in on contract gravity. This is the concept that explains why temporary defense spending rarely returns to normal. Because contracts do not just buy equipment, they build ecosystems. Imagine a government signs a multi-year defense contract. The headlines call it a response to a crisis, a temporary boost, a necessary modernization. But beneath the surface, the contract starts producing infrastructure. It creates skills, facilities, suppliers, training pipelines, maintenance plans, upgrades, replacement cycles. It creates long-term dependency. So even if the crisis ends, the infrastructure remains. And the question changes. It is no longer, do we still need this? It becomes, we already built it, shouldn't we use it? This is contract gravity, the pull of sunk costs, the pull of jobs, the pull of readiness culture, the pull of we can't waste what we built. Now, modern systems intensify this problem, because modern systems are not one-time purchases. A fighter jet is not a one-time purchase. A missile defense system is not a one-time purchase. Even software is not a one-time purchase. Everything has updates, maintenance, training, parts,
new versions, new threats that require new modifications. So the sale is not a sale. It is a relationship, and relationships come with leverage. If you rely on a supplier for parts, you rely on them politically. If you rely on them for software updates, you rely on them strategically. If you rely on them for training, you rely on them operationally. So dependency is not only economic, it is functional. Now add the local layer. Factories create jobs. Jobs create voter pressure. Voter pressure creates political protection. Protection keeps contracts alive, even if the original reasoning fades, even if the timeline slips, even if costs rise. Because canceling becomes a public fight, a fight against workers, against regions, against national security. So contracts become extremely hard to reverse. Now add the alliance layer. Defense procurement often creates compatibility, standards, interoperability, shared systems. That can be valuable, but it also locks in paths. If your allies build a certain way, you build that way too, because the cost of switching becomes massive. So now the contract is not just national, it becomes international architecture. This is why procurement is state design. Now let's talk about time. Defense contracts stretch over years, sometimes decades. That means the people who sign them may not be the people who pay the political cost. A leader signs during a crisis. It looks strong today, but the cost, delays, and dependency appear later, often under the next leader. So contracts are tempting. They create immediate political benefit with delayed accountability. That's another reason the machine grows. Now, here's the most important line. Contract gravity is not evil. It is physics. It is inertia. Once you build a system, the system demands continuation. Because stopping feels like failure. Stopping feels like waste. Stopping feels like vulnerability. So the system continues, and continues, and continues. This is how temporary becomes permanent. Now, why does this matter for you as the viewer? Because if you understand contract gravity, you can see through the public story. When politicians say, "This is a one-time response," you will know what happens next. Maintenance, upgrades, expansions, new phases, new budgets, new reasons. You will predict the future. And that's real power. Now here's the hook. In the next chapters, we connect contract gravity to the world beyond borders. Because once defense becomes a relationship, exports become influence, supply chains become leverage, and the machine stops being only domestic. It becomes geopolitical. That's where this gets serious. So keep watching, because the real story is not the weapon. The real story is dependency.
Chapter 9. The sale is a relationship. Modern systems are complex. A fighter jet is not a one-time purchase. A missile system is not a one-time purchase. Even software is not a one-time purchase. Everything has updates, maintenance, training, parts. So the sale is not a sale. It is a relationship. And relationships come with leverage. If you rely on a supplier for parts, you rely on them politically. If you rely on them for software updates, you rely on them strategically. That is why arms exports are more than commerce. They are foreign policy. And defense companies are not just manufacturers, they are nodes in geopolitical networks. Chapter 10. It's not war, it's uncertainty. Now, some people go too far. They say, so the industry wants war. That is simplistic. Real wars are messy. They disrupt supply chains. They create political risk. They destroy reputations. So the honest framing is different.
The system does not need war. It needs uncertainty. It needs perceived threats. It needs a reason that feels permanent, because permanent reasons justify permanent budgets. And here is the Machiavellian punchline. If you can't control reality, control interpretation. A leader cannot control every event, but they can control the framing of events. And framing shapes budgets. Chapter 11. The Hidden Middle. Most people picture two sides, the state and the industry. But the real machine has a middle layer. Committees, regulators, procurement offices, standards bodies, defense ministries, advisory boards, think tanks, consultants. This middle layer translates fear into policy. It translates policy into specifications, and specifications into winners. Because in procurement, requirements are destiny. Write them one way and only certain companies can meet them. Write them another way and the entire supply chain changes. So the battlefield is not only in the world, it is also on paper. This is where power hides best, not in speeches, in procedures. Chapter 12. Markets, the feedback loop. Now add another layer, markets. When defense stocks surge, it becomes a feedback loop. Rising valuations attract capital. Capital funds expansion. Expansion increases capacity. Capacity increases pressure for long-term commitments, and the boom becomes self-reinforcing. Again. No conspiracy needed, just incentives. Chapter 13. The real strategic question. Now let's be fair. There are real threats. There are real wars. There are real deterrence needs. The goal here is not to say defense is bad. It is to show one thing. Once defense becomes industrialized, it becomes political. And once it becomes political, it resists shrinking. So the question is not, should we defend ourselves? The question is this: how do you defend yourself without creating a machine you can't control? Machiavelli would answer with one brutal principle: control your instruments. Do not become dependent on forces you cannot discipline. In his time, he warned about mercenaries, because mercenaries fight for pay, not for the state. Today, mercenary dependence looks different. Outsourced capability, single suppliers, long supply chains you do not control, politics you cannot predict.
Chapter 14. What smart states do differently. Now let's answer the question everyone avoids. If the defense machine grows by incentives, fear, and momentum, what do smart states do differently? Because here is the truth. You cannot wish the machine away. You cannot moralize it away. And you cannot blame one villain and expect the system to shrink. You can only do one thing. You can design friction. You can build discipline into the system. And this is where Machiavelli becomes surprisingly modern. Machiavelli did not write as a pacifist. He wrote as someone who watched cities collapse because they were unprepared. He saw what happened when a state relied on forces it could not control. He warned against mercenaries for one reason. A state that depends on instruments it cannot discipline is not sovereign. It is rented power. And rented power always comes with conditions. Now translate that into today's world. The modern mercenary problem is not only private soldiers. It is also dependency on single suppliers, dependency on long supply chains you cannot protect, dependency on software and upgrades controlled by someone else. dependency on financing and production capacity you cannot scale without outside help. In Machiavelli's language, it is simple. If you cannot command your instruments, you do not command your fate. So smart states do not treat defense as a growth plan. They treat it as capability. They treat it as sovereignty. And sovereignty means control. Not only spending, control. Now, let's get specific. Smart states do 5 things that weaker states avoid. First, they separate fear from strategy. This sounds small, but it is everything. Fear is loud. Strategy is quiet. Fear demands immediate action. Strategy demands correct action. So a disciplined state creates a rule. In a crisis, we can act fast, but we cannot abandon process. We cannot abandon review. We cannot abandon oversight. Because the moment you abandon oversight, the machine becomes permanent. Machiavelli would agree with this idea in his own way. He believed in decisive action, but he also believed in controlling the political consequences of action. He understood that emergencies create opportunities, not only for enemies, for internal power grabs, for waste, for dependency. So in modern terms, a smart state has crisis speed without crisis blindness. Second, they invest in resilience, not only procurement headlines. Procurement headlines are addictive. A big announcement looks like leadership. A big contract looks like action. A big delivery looks like strength. But resilience is less cinematic. Resilience looks like boring things. Stockpiles, maintenance, training, repair capacity, cyber defense, infrastructure, domestic production of critical parts, redundancy in supply. And redundancy is not glamorous, but it is power. Machiavelli would call this preparation. He wrote that a ruler must be ready before fortune turns, because fortune is unpredictable. And in the modern world, fortune includes supply shocks, component shortages, energy crises, shipping disruptions, political blackmail. So resilience is the modern fortress, not castles, but systems that keep working under pressure. Third, they diversify dependency. This is pure Machiavelli. A ruler must avoid being held hostage by allies, by suppliers, by internal factions, by any group that can say, if you don't pay us, you collapse. So smart states build optionality, multiple suppliers, multiple routes, multiple capabilities. They avoid single points of failure, because a single point of failure is a political vulnerability, and vulnerability invites leverage. In the 1500s, leverage was an army at your border. Today, leverage can be a missing microchip, a delayed shipment, a software lock, a blocked export license. So smart states treat supply chains like strategy, not like shopping. Fourth, they build oversight that survives the crisis. This is the hardest part, because in every crisis, leaders say the same thing. We don't have time. That sentence is the gateway drug. Once you accept we don't have time, you accept shortcuts. Once you accept shortcuts, you accept permanent systems built in panic. So the smart state does something counterintuitive. It pre-builds oversight mechanisms before the crisis. Clear reporting, transparent timelines, independent review, auditable procurement steps, and it commits to them publicly, so that in crisis the leader cannot quietly bypass them. This is not weakness. This is control. Because the most dangerous time for a state is not calm. It is panic. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately.
He saw how fear can change behavior, how urgency can be used by leaders to consolidate power, how tension can silence critics. He would say, if you want to protect the republic, you must control the moments when the crowd is most emotional. That is when systems are hijacked. So oversight is not bureaucracy. Oversight is anti-hijack protection. Fifth, they treat defense spending as part of diplomacy, not a substitute for diplomacy. This is a big one. A lot of states fall into a lazy pattern. They spend more because it feels like doing something. But spending is not strategy. Spending is a tool. A tool without a plan becomes a ritual. You pay to feel safe, not to be safe. So the smart state asks a harder question. What outcome are we buying? Deterrence? Readiness? Independence? Ally interoperability? Domestic resilience? And then it measures success by outcomes, not by how big the budget looks. Now, why does this matter for you, the viewer? Because once you understand what smart states do differently, you can detect the lie in real time. You can tell when a leader is making a strategy decision, and when a leader is making a fear decision. You can tell when a procurement plan builds sovereignty, and when it builds dependency. You can tell when security is used as cover for momentum, and when it is used for real protection. This changes how you read the news. This changes how you interpret budgets. This changes how you interpret the next crisis. And here is the stay to the end reason. In the final chapter, I'm going to give you the one rule that ties everything together. A rule that explains why this machine keeps growing. A rule that helps you see power without getting emotionally pulled by it. And once you understand that rule, you will never look at defense spending the same way again. So keep watching, because the ending is the real lens.
Chapter 15. Final Rule. Now let's land this. The military-industrial complex is not a cartoon villain. It is not a single person. It is not one company. It is not one party. It is a structure. And structures do not have feelings. They only have momentum. That is the lesson. When you look at modern power, stop asking who is evil. That question feels satisfying, but it often blinds you. Because evil is not required for systems to grow. Incentives are enough. So ask better questions. What incentives produce this outcome? Who benefits from urgency? Who benefits from delay? Who benefits when fear becomes permanent? Who benefits when oversight becomes weak? And who pays the price? Because every machine has a cost. Sometimes the cost is money. Sometimes the cost is democratic oversight. Sometimes the cost is dependence. Sometimes the cost is that peace becomes impossible to imagine as a strategy. And that might be the most dangerous cost of all. Eisenhower warned about the influence of this alliance decades ago. Not because defense should disappear, but because permanent influence becomes hard to govern. And when influence is hard to govern, the machine governs you. So here is the final rule. If you want to understand the defense boom, don't watch the battlefield. Watch the incentives. Watch the contracts. Watch the procedures. Watch the narrative. Because that is where the future is decided. On paper. In quiet rooms. Before the first shot is fired. Now, if this video gave you a new way to see power, do two things.
First, subscribe. Because this channel is not about hot takes. It's about systems. It's about strategy. It's about the rules that are running the world when nobody is saying them out loud. Second, comment one word below. Just one word. Budget, narrative, procurement, markets, or lobbying, and tell me which lever you want next. Because the next episode is already loaded. Arms exports, influence without invasion, and how dependency becomes obedience. If you want to understand modern power, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next one.